There is a particular kind of disappearing that nobody warns you about. Not the kind that comes from illness, or from grief, or from the slow dimming of the body. The kind I mean is quieter than all of those. It comes dressed in love. It arrives with good intentions and soft voices, and the genuine, heartfelt concern of people who believe they are helping you. And if you are not paying attention, if you have not done the interior work that makes a person unmanageable by others, it will take everything from you, while everyone involved, including you, believes something wonderful is happening. I am 89 years old. My name is Marvella. I have outlived a husband, a sister, and 2 of my closest companions. I have watched people I admired collapse into dependency, and people I underestimated stand firm until the very end. And I have spent nearly 3 decades studying the difference between those 2 outcomes. Not in books, not in academic settings, but in kitchens and hospital waiting rooms, and the long silences that follow funerals. What I found is that the people who remained themselves, who retained their autonomy, their voice, their daily dignity, were not the luckiest ones, and they were not the healthiest ones. They were the ones who had built 6 specific things inside themselves, long before they were needed. Nobody handed me a list. No mentor sat across from me and said, "Here, Marvella, these are the foundations." I assembled them slowly, from observation and from error. And now I am going to give them to you directly, because you may not have the decades I had to figure it out on your own. The first truth is that your body is not a vessel you inhabit. It is the architecture of your freedom. I came to understand this at 71, during a winter that felt like punishment. My joints had stiffened to the point that descending my front porch steps required a kind of negotiation, me with my own knees, both parties unhappy with the arrangement. I remember standing at the top of those steps one morning, gripping the rail with both hands, and recognizing the look on my neighbor Zebediah's face as he watched from his driveway. Not pity, exactly. Recognition. He had watched his own mother travel this same road. Within a year of that winter, if I had not intervened, I would have become someone who required assistance to move through the most basic geography of her own life. I thought about a woman from my church, Philomena, who had been vigorous and opinionated and impossible to ignore, until she turned 64 and decided that her body had earned its rest. She stopped her morning walks. She stopped her garden. She told herself she was being sensible, protecting herself from injury, conserving energy for what mattered. What actually happened was that her world contracted in direct proportion to her stillness. First, she stopped driving at night. Then she stopped driving altogether. Then the stairs in her home became impassable. Then her daughter moved her into the back bedroom of a house that was not her own, in a town that held no memories for her, surrounded by people who loved her but could not return to her the life she had gradually, willingly surrendered. I went back to moving. Not athletically, not impressively. I walked the length of my street and back each morning, regardless of my mood or the weather's opinion on the matter. I did slow, deliberate exercises in my kitchen while the coffee brewed. I carried my own groceries. I climbed my own stairs. And the body, which I had begun to regard as an adversary, slowly revealed itself as an ally that simply required consistent collaboration. At 89, I open my own jars. I tend my own small garden. I walk to the post office without announcing it to anyone or requiring accompaniment. These are not achievements. They are the minimum conditions of a life that belongs to me. Protect your mobility not because you fear death, but because you understand that the erosion of physical independence is the first door through which all other dependencies enter. The second truth is that simplicity is not a diminishment. It is a form of power that most people discover far too late. For most of my adult life, I confused the size of my life with the quality of it. More square footage, more commitments, more objects that required dusting, insuring, replacing. I believed, the way many people believe without ever examining the belief, that abundance was the same thing as security. The unraveling of that idea happened gradually, then suddenly, in the years following my husband Cornelius's death, when I was confronted with the full weight of a life built for two, now carried by one. I watched what happened to a man on my street named Alistair, who spent his entire working life acquiring a standard of living he could not sustain once that working life ended. The house was too large, the property taxes too aggressive, the maintenance an endless, humiliating negotiation between his fixed income and the building's demands. He began accepting money from his son, not gladly, but because the architecture of his life had left him no other option. And with that money came the invisible debt that financial dependency always carries. The softening of opinions, the swallowing of objections, the slow renegotiation of who exactly was in charge. By the time he was 82, Alistair was living in his own home, but operating almost entirely within the preferences of his son. The house was his. The life inside it no longer was. I made the choice to need less. I moved into a smaller place, one floor, manageable by a single person without heroics. I reduced my expenses to the point where my modest income covered them without stress and without asking. I stopped purchasing comfort as a substitute for contentment. And what replaced the accumulation was something I had not anticipated: a lightness, a negotiating position. When you do not depend on anyone financially, you are not obligated to perform gratitude for their opinions. When your costs are low, no one holds a financial lever over your life. The people who remain free in old age are rarely the wealthiest. They are consistently the ones whose needs have been pared down to what is genuine, leaving nothing for circumstance or family or misfortune to hold hostage. The third truth is that your health is not a condition you were assigned. It is a practice you either maintain or abandon. I will not be gentle about this, because the consequences are not gentle. I have sat beside too many people in their final years who were spending those years entirely on the management of damage they had spent decades accumulating. My cousin Erskine comes to mind with a particular sharpness. He was brilliant and funny and entirely cavalier about every signal his body sent him across 5 decades. He ate without attention. He moved without intention. He treated the doctor as someone you visited when the situation had already become alarming, rather than someone who helped you prevent the alarm from sounding at all. At 76, the accounting arrived. A cascade of diagnoses, each one spawning its own specialist, its own prescription, its own scheduling burden. He did not die quickly. He spent 11 years as the full-time curator of his own medical complexity. His calendar structured entirely around appointments, and his pantry organized around restrictions. That became his life. Not living, administering. I took a different approach, not because I am exceptional in my discipline, but because I had watched enough people like Erskine to understand what neglect compounded into. I began treating daily movement as non-negotiable when I was in my early 60s. I learned to cook in ways that sustained rather than merely satisfied. I slept with the seriousness it deserved. I attended my annual medical appointments as a matter of strategy rather than crisis response, because I understood that the difference between a problem caught early and a problem caught late could be measured in years of freedom. Today, at 89, I manage my own health without a pharmaceutical architecture holding me upright. My physician uses words that surprise her. I use words like agency and intention. What I have now, the ability to govern my own body, to not require a rotating cast of medical appointments as the backbone of my weekly schedule, is the direct return on decades of small, consistent choices. Health is not luck distributed unevenly. It is a practice, and its dividends are paid in freedom. The fourth truth is that loss will come for you repeatedly, and your survival of it cannot be outsourced. This is the truth people most want to skip. I understand the impulse. But after 70, loss stops being the exception and begins being the texture of life itself. The people you have built everything around will leave. Through death, through the drift of time, through the 1,000 quiet ways that people become unavailable to one another. And when they go, you will face a choice that no one can make for you, in a moment when you are least equipped to make it clearly. Will you metabolize this grief yourself, or will you make it someone else's problem to solve? When Cornelius died, I was 67. We had been the kind of companions who finish each other's sentences, not because we thought alike, but because we had spent so many years learning the rhythm of the other person's thoughts. His absence was not a gap, it was a geographic event. It rearranged the entire landscape, and I could see with great clarity, in the weeks that followed, exactly how easy it would be to collapse that grief outward, to make my children responsible for my recovery, to fill every silence with a summons, to transform my loss into their obligation. I watched my friend Temperance do exactly this after her husband passed. She did not do it cruelly. She did it from genuine pain, and the people who loved her responded with genuine devotion. But the devotion could not fix what it was being asked to fix, because grief is not a problem that other people's presence resolves. It is a passage that only you can walk. Temperance never walked it. She stood at the entrance and waited for someone to carry her through, and the waiting became her entire life. Her children, guilt-ridden and exhausted, could not leave her alone for long enough to build lives of their own. She was not a burden in the way that word is usually meant, but she had made her incompleteness into their responsibility, and the weight of that was real and cumulative. I grieved Cornelius fully. I did not perform recovery for anyone's comfort, and I did not perform collapse for anyone's sense of purpose. I cried in the middle of the night, and I kept my commitments in the morning. I let myself be shattered, and I kept showing up anyway. And slowly, over 2 years that were the most interior years of my life, I built something new out of what remained. Not a replacement, a continuation. The willingness to stand up after loss, without requiring someone else to lift you, is not coldness. It is the most serious form of self-respect available to you, and without it, you will spend your later years pulling others down into the gravity of your unfinished grief. The fifth truth is that the people who love you most are also the people most capable of slowly erasing you. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I do not mean it as an accusation, and it is not a reason to keep your family at a distance. What I mean is structural. When you age, the people who care about you will, with increasing frequency and confidence, begin making decisions that belong to you. They will do it from love. They will do it from fear. They will do it because society has quietly told them that after a certain age, your judgment requires supervision. And they have absorbed this message without examining it. I watched it happen to a man named Oleander, who was 72, mentally acute, physically capable, and entirely sovereign over his life, until his adult children decided he was not. It began with the car. Then it was the investment account. Then it was the question of whether he should really be living alone. Each decision arrived wrapped in concern, and Oleander, who had not done the work of knowing himself clearly enough to hold his own line, went along with each one, not because he agreed, but because disagreeing felt like ingratitude. By 80, he was living in a configuration designed entirely around his family's anxiety, and the man I had known, sharp-tongued and self-directed and fiercely independent, had been managed into someone I barely recognized. He was comfortable. He was also gone. When my own daughter began suggesting that perhaps I might be happier somewhere with more support structure, I did not shout at her, and I did not cry. I told her with complete composure that I appreciated her concern and recognized it came from a real place, and that I was fully capable of determining my own living arrangements, and that the day I was not, I would say so plainly. I held that line for 3 years of intermittent pressure. I held it because I knew myself clearly enough to distinguish between what I actually needed and what someone else's worry was prescribing. That clarity, knowing your own values, your own non-negotiables, the things you will not surrender without a fight, is not stubbornness. It is the last and most important fortress. Without it, love itself becomes the mechanism of your disappearance. The sixth truth is that the story you tell yourself about aging will determine the life you are permitted to live inside of it. I have known people who decided in their mid-60s that they were old. Not that they were aging, that they had arrived at old, as if it were a destination that, once reached, required no further navigation. They stopped trying new things. They stopped contradicting people. They accepted smaller and smaller portions of life with a kind of philosophical resignation that they mistook for wisdom. and aging, which is simply the passage of time through a body, became something different in their hands. It became a permission structure for diminishment. I decided something different. Not that I would pretend the years were not accumulating. They are. Not that I would refuse to acknowledge limitation. I have them. But I decided that the narrative of who I was would not be written by my age, or by my family's fears, or by a culture that has very little use for old women who refuse to become decorative. I continued to have opinions. I continued to argue for them. I continued to learn, not because learning was productive, but because curiosity is a form of aliveness, and aliveness is not something I intend to relinquish before I am actually required to. There is a woman I know named Xiomara, who is 84, and who has spent the last 15 years making herself increasingly small, in the hope that smallness would protect her from the discomforts of being seen. She does not express preferences in case they inconvenience someone. She does not push back on decisions in case pushback causes conflict. She has become deeply, profoundly pleasant in a way that has cost her almost everything recognizable from the woman she once was. People describe her as serene. What she actually is, I think, is absent. She traded herself for peace and received neither. The story you carry about who you are, about what you are entitled to want, to insist upon, to refuse, is not a small thing. It is the operating system on which every other freedom runs. Tend it deliberately. Challenge anyone, including yourself, who tries to install a smaller version. Here is what I know at 89. From a house that is my own, on a morning that belongs entirely to me. Having made every significant decision of the last 2 decades without requiring anyone's permission or financial support. Freedom in old age is not delivered. It is constructed. It is built quietly, over years, from habits and choices, and the disciplined refusal to let other people's comfort determine the shape of your existence. The 6 things, your physical autonomy, your liberation from excess need, your practiced daily health, your capacity to carry grief without distributing it, your knowledge of yourself as a person who cannot be quietly overridden, and the story you tell about what your life is still allowed to be. None of them arrive as gifts. All of them are built. And all of them can begin today, regardless of what today looks like, regardless of what has already been lost or allowed to slip. You will not regret the building. You will only ever look back and wish you had begun sooner. So begin now, while the ground beneath you is still yours to stand on.